So our next panel discussion is actually going to be focusing on crafting an ETRM desk from inception, strategies, and insights. We've got a really experienced panel here with us. We've got George and Earl Burns. George is currently the head of the market risk at Petrocas Energy Group as a trained mathematician and certified financial sustainability and climate risk manager. He's the product owner of an outsourced ETRM solution and the lead developer of an in-house ETRM solution, while also leading the whole spectrum of risk identification, processing, and design of the group's business activities. All is an energy executive with over 30 years of front and middle office experience in the sector, working for global and regional players in the space. And today we want to tap into both Earl and George to really understand from their experiences, what it takes to actually setting up a good ETRM desk from inception to actually executing it successfully in line with the enterprise. So with that said, let me start with George here. George,
hi,
we are operating.
Hi, Monika, and thanks for the invitation. Talking through the risk management lens, it goes without saying that crafting an ETRM desk needs a holistic approach, aligned with the broader framework of enterprise risk management, which is mostly captured on 5 pillars. So from a top-down vantage point, we have 2 pillars. Number 1, the board and senior executives must exercise risk oversight while cultivating an exemplary risk culture in the organization. Number 2, they must also understand and evaluate external factors and megatrends as they directly inform the risk appetite of an organization and its subsequent ability to act strategically and allocate the resources effectively throughout. From a bottom-up vantage point, we have another set of 2 pillars. Number 1, organizations should be able to reassess risks, considering any substantial changes to their business context, which is happening so fast nowadays, and perform periodic audits, internal audits, regarding the effectiveness of the enterprise risk management processes. Number 2, timeliness in communication of risk information is where technology comes into play, where the goal of harmonizing data from multiple sources, external and internal, and aggregating them into meaningful information. Now, linking top-down to bottom-up is the 5th and most central pillar. This is where the enterprise risk management function proactively follows the risk identification and assessment process by gathering data on the financial implications of potential disruptions or opportunities, considering factors such as market conditions, geopolitical events, or regulatory changes or whatsoever. The organization can then prioritize its risk responses, accepts or whatever, and align them with its strategic objectives, thus employing the necessary agility to navigate through the global uncertainties that we see today. I pause here. Monika, back to you.
Oh, thank you very much for that, George. That was really insightful. How about you, Earl? Based on your experiences, what are your thoughts in this space?
I mean, thank you for the opportunity to participate today. And yeah, George really got off to a really good start there and touched upon a bunch of areas. I mean, I guess the only things I could really add or embellish to what George said is that I think you need to, from a corporate perspective, understand what is your ETRM meant to feed. And by that, I meant in most entities that need to build out and employ an ETRM, you are generally feeding an ERP system from a data perspective. It's about getting the accounting lined out and right so that the exposures are effectively represented in the right way, to trust what the business is doing, to be able to measure that risk. I mean, if you're not measuring it, you can't manage it. So you need to properly measure it. I guess in going back to that original point I made about understanding what the entity wants, I think it's very important that that balance be struck between what's needed by the business, by the trading business, relative to what needs to be represented relative to the activities, rolling that up to what is needed. Really, it's going to be from the finance function as well as the risk function from a control perspective and the compliance function, which goes into this, because compliance looks at a lot of the exposures that risk reports, the independent risk reporting function, and takes a look and says, hey, is there a conversation we need to have about the nature of how compliant we are versus exchanges, regulators, and other internal benchmarks, the external and internal benchmarks is the point I'm trying to make. So I think that's the only point I'd want to add, is that being aligned from an enterprise perspective, and this isn't speaking to the enterprise risk side of it, as George mentioned as well, but from an enterprise perspective, what are you trying to accomplish and who are you trying to accomplish it for?
That's a tremendous point. Also, if I were to actually bring both the points of view together, I think the two key takeaways that I have is, number one, we want to make sure that your ETRM strategy is in line with the enterprise strategy. This is not something that you can actually do in parallel, or this is not something that you can do in silo. And secondly, you want to make sure how that information is going to be utilized. Who is going to use that information for what purposes is very important, because that will help gauge and determine how do you actually set up your ETRM desk. So that's phenomenal. Now then, building on to those thoughts that have been laid out so far, and I'm going to start with you, Earl, here. Based on your experience, what do you think are some of the learnings that our listeners should keep in mind as they are thinking of setting up the ETRM desks within their own organizations?
Okay. Thanks again for the ability to lead off on this question. And I think in our setup conversation, one of the things that myself and George talked about is that, and I'm completely aligned with him on this, he may add to this, is that an ETRM should really be, you should be willing to put in the heavy lifting and the hard work to bespoke coding to get to what you need. I.e., there needs to be an element of it being your own setup. And what I mean by that is that you can buy an off-the-shelf solution. I won't get into mentioning names here because I'm not supposed to, and I don't want to show any favoritism. But there are a lot of off-the-shelf solutions that can be adjusted to your needs. Maybe the better thing to do is to actually invest in the coding and in that intellectual horsepower, that IT horsepower, to build out your own solution. Trading's always going to want everything. And trading is going to have substantial needs that should be met and which you have to meet in order to be able to properly categorize, assess, data warehouse, and report the risk. But sometimes the hill isn't worth the climb. 80% in my view generally is about good enough, although trading is always going to push for more. There have been some large energy trading entities, when you look at the power side, the commodity side, as well as the big oil side, that have gone, from what I've seen, 2 to 6 times their original budgets relative to trying to take an off-the-shelf ETRM or build one up out of an ERP, and it just ends up being not fit for purpose, and it ends up costing you a lot of money in additional coding, because it's not like you can start over from a particular point at a point in time, as George will tell you, relative to building the coding and building that architecture. You really have to, in a lot of cases, rip that down and start over again, hence the cost factor. So I think, and I want to leave George some time to talk, but I think in what I've seen from looking at it from both sides, building something from scratch versus taking something out of the box and tweaking it, you may be better off if you're very serious about the trading entity and the ability to report those exposures and those market risks, and the ability to feed into an enterprise risk management program and feed compliance, finance, and other functions. A lot of times, if you have complexity, you're better off building something yourself.
Well, thank you for that, Earl. George, what are your thoughts? Having, being a product owner yourself, managing a solution, owning a solution, and then also setting up an in-house solution. What are some of your thoughts here?
I think the most important consideration on building ETRM is between choosing outsourced or building in-house. This is the most important thing to consider. Echoing what Earl has said, I couldn't agree more, basically, but we have to shed some light on some factors that our decision is going to be based on. So one of the factors is the level of customization we need. So if we need to drill down a lot, depending on the vendor that might or might not have the solution, we might as well build it ourselves. So that's one factor, the level of depth we need. Another thing is whether you can find talents in risk management who can code and don't rely on your IT, for example, on doing that. Because anyway, if you go into a vendor, as Earl said, it's not like you're not gonna have to code. You're gonna have to code either way. So in each of the cases, you need to find and hire and cultivate these risk talents who have the coding knowledge. Another factor that you need to consider is your budget. So how much budget you have and how much time you have. And this depends also on the, let's say, the size of the organization. If you're a big organization, you might fit in more custom-made solution or fit in more out-of-the-shelf solution. So it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. And last but not least, you have to have the capacity in-house, either way, to harness the simplicity out of non-linearity, complexity, and the multidimensionality of the interplay of a combination of both mainstream risk drivers, but also exotic, like climate, cyber, and supply chain, which are becoming more mainstream nowadays. So these are from my side, my comments.
No, thank you. Thank you for that, George. And I think if I were to combine your responses, both of you articulated the same thing, which is there needs to be a balance, which is driven by what your needs are. And those needs might be coming from various aspects of your business, but you really need to balance between, complete custom solution or an off-the-shelf solution, whether it's outsourced or insourced, doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, you need to balance, which is going to be driven by what you need, which is going to be driven by your budget, which is going to be driven by your resources. So now this is really tremendous because these are so pragmatic points of views that are so important for making sure that any kind of a ETRM solution you are trying to pursue is actually effectively executed throughout the organization. So with that, I know we're getting...
Monika.
Go ahead, please.
Monika, one point that I want to make that George made, which I think is an excellent point. He couldn't have made it better. I just want to maybe overemphasize it a bit. Is that I think people get into trouble relative to these from a budget perspective because they'll think that something off the shelf won't require quite a bit of coding in order to make it work for what you need. And I think that's the largest single mistake that folks make relative to an ETRM if they choose something off the shelf, is that you have to do the heavy lifting relative to coding. You have to budget, probably over budget for it, and be realistic about what it's going to take to meet your needs. So just wanted to make that point.
That is really important, Earl, and thank you for emphasizing it because I think, in my experience, having led a digital transformation program at Chevron at the global scale, at the enterprise scale, I think my one experience is very much in line with yours. If you don't set the expectations right, success becomes very difficult. And I think that expectations management is a critical part of making sure that even if the message is hard, it's better to deliver it so you can actually bring people along with you as you're deploying these solutions. So no, thank you very much for raising that and bringing that up. Really appreciate that. So in a nutshell, I know we're getting close to our time limit on the panel. If I were to give you each one sentence and one sentence only, what would you want your listeners to walk away with? And I'm going to start with George.
One sentence.
One sentence.
If you are a risk manager, invest in you. If you are an employer, invest in hiring and nurturing such talent in risk manager from a STEM background with lots of coding knowledge and with the ability to catch up on different subjects on different fields at all times. That's my one sentence.
Thank you. That was really insightful. Earl, what about you?
Yeah, I'll again dovetail off of what George said. George knows what he's talking about, and I look forward to working with him in the future on these sorts of things. But don't compromise, and that's a very short sentence, but I'll expand on that a little bit relative to don't compromise. Don't compromise on what you think your risk reporting needs to be to meet that enterprise need, because you're trying to either save a bit of money relative to putting your ETRM in place, or quite frankly, any other IT program which may support it. Do not compromise on it, because if you're trying to make sure that you underpin the credibility of the business, of that trading business, that business that needs to have that exposure understood and reported, you have to measure it properly so you can manage it properly. If any of those parts drop out, then you're not properly reporting exposure. You're opening the company up to not only financial losses or lack of understanding of what's going on relative to the exposure, but even on a bigger perspective, you're opening yourself up from a regulatory perspective, potentially regulatory compliance, which that can shut the company down. Losing money may shut the company down eventually, obviously, but regulatory issues and certain compliance issues will shut you down immediately. So do not compromise your, whatever underpins what your theory is relative to, or your thesis is a better term to use, relative to risk reporting to fit an ETRM. The ETRM has to fit what you need as the output.
Oh, this is fantastic. George and Earl, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to both of you. And I think if I were to walk away, my key takeaways from this discussion really is, I would say, three-pronged, and then I'm going to actually get a recap of what you just commented in your walk-away sentences. So overall strategy has to be aligned with your enterprise strategy. That is critically important. You want to make sure you understand what the business needs. And finally, you need to be able to balance between various tools and solutions in such a manner that actually it meets your needs, and it's not just being given to you, in an off-shelf product manner. And this will get into issues and questions around your resources, your budget, and again, making sure that your business needs, especially from a compliance perspective, are accurately understood, and they are, your solution can actually meet those needs. So thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. Any parting remarks, please feel free. Otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to Sid.